Distinguished guests, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, present here at the National Defense University, as well as all of those joining us online, good morning and welcome. I am Commander Sakari Soini, and I have the pleasure of being the moderator here today in this seminar session. I currently serve as the principal teacher of naval warfare at the Department of Warfare here at the National Defense University. The topic of this first session is today is military strategy and operational art, focusing on naval affairs and naval warfare in the Black Sea. As for the program of this session, our two guest speakers will hold approximately 25-minute presentations, followed by a 30-minute panel discussion, providing our audience with an opportunity to engage in deepened discussion with the panelists. There will also be a quick possibility for Q&A right after each presentation, time permitting. Without further ado, the title of the first presentation is "The War in the Black Sea. The character of naval warfare is undergoing a fundamental shift caused by drone technology." To discuss this topic, I have the pleasure of presenting our first expert speaker, Lieutenant Commander Dr. Tobias Kolakowski, who is a research fellow at the German Institute for Defense and Strategic Studies. During his military career in the German Armed Forces, Dr. Kolakowski has served as an intelligence analyst at the Strategic Reconnaissance Command, and as well as acting department head at the German Naval Command. Moreover, he is a doctor of philosophy from King's College in London. Doctor, the floor is yours.
Is a disruptive technology. The disruptive introduction into all spheres of activity, including the military industry, is necessary. Undoubtedly, they're used primarily in the Navy, because a ship in service with the Navy is a complex system, and the activities of a modern fleet without the use of these technologies seem hardly imaginable. Admiral Alexander Moiseev, Chief of the Russian Navy, last year at the International Maritime Salon in Kronstadt. There is little reason to doubt the sincerity of Moiseev's words, given that the Russian naval leadership had to witness the devastation caused by uncrewed systems to their own naval force firsthand. Since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Russian Black Sea Fleet has suffered significant losses. According to various Western and Ukrainian sources, almost 3 years of fighting have left between 1/4 and 1/3 of the Russian Black Sea Fleet disabled or destroyed, and in 2024, the British Defense Minister assessed that the Black Sea Fleet had been rendered, I quote, functionally inactive. In addition to missile strikes, uncrewed systems in the air and the surface, combining mass, speed, and explosive ordnance, have caused this damage through incremental attrition. Numerous Russian combatants, landing and combat support ships were damaged or even sunk, and Russia has been forced to significantly strengthen its defenses and physical barriers that can be seen here on the illustration by H.I. Sutton to limit the entrance to the naval base at Sevastopol. As a consequence of this long campaign, the Ukrainians were able to severely restrict the freedom of movement of Russian warships in the Black Sea, and Ukrainian attacks against ships and infrastructure have forced Russian vessels to redeploy to bases at the eastern Black Sea shore. The changing character of the littoral operational environment and the ever greater challenges conventional navies have to face when operating in narrow seas, where they are confronted with both numerous crewed and uncrewed weapon systems, have gained attention far beyond the war in the Black Sea. To give one example, in light of present-day changes in the environment in which navies have to operate, the British First Sea Lord has recently spoken of a dreadnought moment. In naval history, the launch of HMS Dreadnought in 1906 was a revolutionary development, making preceding battleship classes obsolete. One interpretation awards uncrewed naval systems a similar revolutionary role in naval warfare. Not all experts, however, agree with this assessment. Scholars have drawn attention to the circumstance that Ukraine's spectacular successes with uncrewed systems are predicated on conditions specific to this very conflict and the geographic theater in which it is waged in. These conditions are not easily replicable, and the relevance of uncrewed systems for other naval forces limited, so the argument goes. In order to engage with this heated debate, I would like to take a more abstract look and present to you three theses that may contribute to imposing structure to the discussion and informing practical conclusions. Thesis number one: there are no finite answers to an evolving problem. When Nazi Germany and the United Kingdom signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement in 1935, Germany was allowed to rebuild a subsurface fleet. Apparently, the British were convinced that after World War I, German U-boats could no longer pose an existential threat to British sea lines. Apparently, due to ASTIC, the British version of sonar, the 1913 London Submarine Protocol, and the conviction that surface ships would prevail in anti-submarine warfare, the submarine menace had been averted. Apparently, this assessment was proven wrong, as wolf packs of German U-boats under Grand Admiral Dönitz adopted new tactics and, later in the war, new technologies that underlined the continuing value of the submarine. I refer to the example of the submarine because submarines are still a comparatively new weapon system, historically speaking, while also having undergone several development cycles, resulting in various generations. As shown on this illustration, we start with the Confederate CSS Hunley, which used muscle power, and the conventional submarines of the world wars. Then comes the early Cold War period and an entire evolution of guided torpedoes, and we enter the age of nuclear-powered submarines capable of employing submarine-launched long-range surface-to-surface missiles. The evolution of submarines on which we can look back gives us an impression of the potential evolution of naval drones which may lie ahead of us. In 2022, Ukraine experienced its first successes and some failures, of course, when they deployed the first generation maritime drone, the one seen on the top on the left-hand side. In a second step, naval drones were concentrated to apply swarm attacks, saturating and overwhelming the defensive capabilities of lightly armed Russian surface vessels. Furthermore, the Magura 5, seen on the right-hand side on the top, which was used at least since 2023, featured better designs. Since 2022, the Russians have been reported to make use of helicopters to employ firepower against USVs from an elevated position. Now, the Ukrainians didn't take long to develop countermeasures. At least since May 2024, video footage that had been released by the conflict parties indicated that Ukraine had begun arming USVs with heat-seeking air-to-air missiles in order to put Russian air assets on anti-USV patrol on risk. Subsequently, on 31st December 2024, Ukrainian government agencies released video footage supposedly showing a Magura 5 USV destroying one Russian Mi-8 helicopter and damaging a second one. The missile used was apparently an R-73, which was originally an air-to-air missile, but it had been adapted to the Sea Dragon surface-launched naval version. In December 23, and that's the picture down on the left-hand side, the Russians were reported to have tested small UAS, also unmanned aerial systems, from a patrol boat in an anti-USV role. So we have robots attacking robots. For the future, various evolutions, such as underwater vehicles functioning as drone motherships, can be envisioned. To refer back to the Anglo-German naval agreement, yes, autonomous systems are still currently facing certain limitations. For example, concerning the range or the environment, as Duncan Redford, historian at the Ministry of Defense of the United Kingdom, has pointed out. But with such a broad range of constantly evolving drone designs and their potential uses, it would be a mistake to think about potential threats and opportunities only in a particular category of capabilities at a very specific moment. Comparing the drone with the submarine also brings up another discussion about the strategic school of thought which is closely associated with the use of submarines, the jeune école. This brings us to thesis number 2. The character of war at sea is undergoing a fundamental shift. At the beginning of this presentation, I have elaborated on the successful campaign Ukraine, also both the military and the security services, have launched against the reinforced Russian Black Sea Fleet, a numerically much superior force with significant anti-surface and land attack strike capabilities. Many of Ukraine's accomplishments can be attributed to attacks by Ukrainian uncrewed systems, both in the air and at the surface. With the exception of commerce warfare, Ukraine's approach to naval warfare in the Black Sea fits with the jeune école strategic school of thought. I quote, "Speed and numbers, in the words of Arne Røksund, the mantra of the jeune école, stand at the heart of Ukraine's approach to naval warfare. Furthermore, various videos released by Ukrainian security agencies show attacks against Russian ships under conditions of low visibility, especially at night. At that time, the drones can take full advantage of their small signatures. Immediately, nighttime torpedo boat attacks against bigger and much more heavily armed combatants, one of the jeune école's leitmotifs, comes to mind. To sum up, means and ways in which Ukraine applied to erode the Black Sea Fleet's strength resembled jeune école thinking at its core. And we have to take into consideration that the Russian Navy will adapt to the changing character of the conflict at sea, just like the Russian ground forces in the Donbass are adapting to the new realities at land, as we've heard yesterday in at least 2 presentations. The speech by Admiral Maiseyev, from which I have cited at the beginning, plans to weaponize the Russian USV Vizier by the military-industrial holding KMZ, and statements by Nikolai Patrushev, former Secretary of the Security Council of Russia and aide to the President of Russia, that, I quote, "The Russian Navy is already being equipped with unmanned boats and that their production has been significantly increased based on the experience of the special military operation," end of quote, all point into this direction. In this case, NATO would be faced with a severe asymmetric threat. The challenge that drone technology poses is so serious because it can benefit from a dilemma that is specific to the phase of warship production in our era. Our warships have become so highly sophisticated, so complex in their capabilities to wage multidimensional warfare that they have become incredibly expensive. And, as logical consequences, the orders of battle of our navies, or at least of most of our navies, have become smaller and smaller. In contrast, we witness systems that can have devastating effects and can be mass-produced at relatively low cost, both concerning material and human beings. In fact, this cost efficiency in naval warfare has achieved a quality of its own. Let's recall the fate of HMS Prince of Wales, a battleship and also one of the most modern and most sophisticated ships of its era, that was sunk together with HMS Repulse by Japanese naval aircraft in late 1941. Did the Japanese sustain casualties? Yes, they did. But the loss of a handful of airplanes and not even 24 pilots was absolutely disproportionate to the loss of a 44,000-ton battleship and another battle cruiser. As Jacqueline Schneider and Julia MacDonald in their article Looking Back to Look Forward, Autonomous Systems, Military Revolutions, and the Importance of Cost argue, this is the actual revolution in military affairs we are witnessing. As a consequence, we may also have to think differently about the employment of certain weapon systems. During World War II, the role battleships played, for example, became less about surface-to-surface engagements, the role they had been designed for, and more about serving as in a supporting role to provide anti-aircraft gun fire to defend carriers from enemy airstrikes. This role was especially crucial when Allied fleets were faced with the kamikaze threat at the end of the war. Extensive armament and stopping power above else was needed to counter the sacrificial tactics of the enemy. Similar to countering kamikazes, defending against uncrewed surface systems, which are used in suicidal attacks, also requires significant stopping power. Given that under current conditions, not capital ships, but more lightly armed surface combatants are most vulnerable to drone attacks, we may have to rethink their role. We should, however, not only perceive the use of drones as a threat to our conventional fleets, but also understand the great opportunities that automated systems award us, especially considering offensive drone usage. In this spirit, I would like to offer to take a look at the Crimean War as another source for inspiration. During the Crimean War, the British Royal Navy was confronted with extraordinary challenges posed by Russia's daring fortifications, especially the fortress Sevastopol in the Black Sea and the fortresses guarding the movement of shipping in the Gulf of Finland. These massive bastions, carved into Finnish granite and armed with hundreds of guns, were nearly impregnable and impassable from the point of view of a ship of the line. In the so-called Great Armament of 1854 to 1856, the British came up with various solutions to the problem. There is one I would like to draw your attention to. Instead of employing major surface combatants as they usually did, the British employed small, very fast, steam-powered craft. These boats were highly agile and difficult for the Russian gunners to target. Instead of shooting against the fortress horizontally, they were armed with mortars, aiming for the roofs that were much more vulnerable to fire. After some heavy bombardment, the Russian fortress at Helsingfors, here just on the island to our west, was cracked and Russian gunpowder magazines detonated. Now, more than 150 years later, there is another mighty Russian fortress in the Black Sea in form of Russian A2AD capabilities. Thank you for the FOI for the graph. These put any potentially hostile naval vessel at considerable risk. In their subsection on uncrewed systems, Hugh and Guerriere write, I quote, "A major tactical consequence of the introduction of uncrewed systems will be to hasten the shift to smaller systems that are more numerous, less costly, and more difficult to detect. As the number of such robots increase, their inherent resilience will improve." End of quote. With the exception of the term robot, this description would also be perfectly fitting to describe the fast attack craft procured under the Great Armament by the British. Some analysts have emphasized the continuing significance of conventional naval operations. Particularly, these arguments draw attention to the blue water context where it's more difficult for drones to operate, although not impossible, especially if we think about the employment of motherships. This argument seems to have considerable merit. But there is no need to push the argument to the extreme. Has the evolution and the developments that are taking place in front of our eyes already qualify as a significant evolution, if not revolution, of naval warfare? Has the advent of the airplane replaced the warship as an instrument of naval warfare? No, it has not. But it has fundamentally changed the character of war at sea. Since World War I, we can no longer think about naval warfare without naval aviation. Likewise, we can conclude that henceforward, each balanced fleet will have to understand uncrewed systems as an integral element of its fleet design. Come to the last thesis, number 3. To face challenges of uncrewed technologies, leadership and effective human resource management are key. In the aftermath of World War I, German naval officers like Helmut Haie, Friedrich Ruge, and Siegfried Sorge analyzed the 1980 mutiny of German sailors, which had subsequently incited revolutionary movements throughout Germany. They refined German naval leadership principles in officer education, one of the reasons that motivation within the German Kriegsmarine remained high until the very end of the Second World War, despite being hopelessly outnumbered by the Allies. Concerning confidence, Sorge writes, "It is not possible to lead people to the highest performance and above all to reliability and truthfulness if all the measures of the leader are based on mistrust, if behind every sailor, even when it's not necessary, there is a non-commissioned officer. Behind every non-commissioned officer, there is an officer." End of quote. Why am I talking to you about trust in human beings when the topic of my presentation is automated systems? Well, if you remember my first thesis, I said that we are dealing with continuously changing systems. This implies that the responses we have to develop also have to evolve constantly to address these challenges. Some of the challenges connected with unmanned naval systems may not even be known to us in the present. Thus, identifying problem statements that can be worked with and solutions, may they be tactical, technical, or doctrinal, cannot be centrally commanded. They have to be developed bottom-up by committed, innovative officers and enlisted men who are willing to think outside the box. This brings us back to the case of the Russo-Ukrainian War and the extensive damage suffered by the Black Sea Fleet. The easy way out, as some commentators have done, would be to describe the Russian military as incompetent. Not discounting the possibility that maybe some Russian vessels had indeed been deployed to combat without the necessary standard of combat proficiency, personally, I find this explanation lacking. Firstly, incompetence is not very specific in its criticism and therefore of little analytical value. Secondly, I've met some Russian officers in the past, among others when serving at the German embassy in Moscow, and while I certainly did not agree with some opinions, incompetence is not a term I would generally associate with my interlocutors. Rather, as a methodological challenge, we should ask ourselves the question if our European navies would have performed that much better under similar circumstances. If there is some hesitation to answer with a definite yes to this question, addressing the question of leadership culture may be of interest to our armed forces. Evolution of automated defense technologies, offensive or defensive, starts with the honest realization that capabilities or doctrines in a certain field are no longer adequate. It required courageous cavalry commanders to tell their general, "No, sir, I will not carry out that cavalry charge because in the age of the machine gun, this is no longer practical." 100 years later, honesty requires similar bravery. Do our systems encourage such honest reports? Or do our subordinates have to think twice before making reports that could be perceived as negative? Maybe because they fear the next personal assessment and the potential loss of an opportunity to get promoted. Following the identification of a problem, finding solutions is at least as risky. Think about the long lists of accidents, many fatal, when airships and airplanes were first introduced in the militaries 100 years ago. For systems to be innovative and at the edge of technological and tactical advance, it does make a difference whether the people in charge at the grassroots level, who are supposed to foster innovation, constantly have to worry about being personally held responsible if something goes wrong. This requires an organization to adopt an open and constructive approach to making mistakes. It does make a difference whether the principal concern of these people is about covering their back or whether they can rest assured that the system will hold a protecting hand over them when case experiments fail. For example, when the connection is interrupted and a naval drone worth €1 million is lost. It does make a difference whether the decision makers in our navies are personally committed to innovation because they see their efforts bring about positive change. If we want our navies to be innovators in naval drone technology, we need to create the right environment for innovation. In this regard, Ukraine's military intelligence services, or as Kristen and Mark have yesterday pointed out in their presentation, the entire decentralized military industrial complex can be a positive role model to emulate. In this brief presentation, I have outlined some of the challenges of automatization which require us to think in quickly developing cycles. Once again in history, we are dealing with a significant transformation of naval warfare. We have to adopt our mindsets to foster innovation and agility. Otherwise, we will continue to produce today's fleets that may not meet tomorrow's challenges. Of course, I haven't come up with all of these ideas myself, so I would like to thank these institutions for their support. And this concludes my presentation, and I'm looking forward to our panel in a few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Kolakowski, and for the very insightful and presentation, providing us with a very interesting historical perspective to this rather, and even a human resource perspective to this rather technological dilemma, which seems technological at first. Since the clock is ticking, I propose that we move to the second presenter and spare the questions to the panel afterwards. So the title of the second presentation is Russian Military Strategy and Operational Art in the Black Sea, Lessons from Experience, Theory Development, and Prospects. And to discuss this topic, please allow me to present today's second expert speaker, joining us online via Zoom. Please welcome Captain Navy, retired, Stefan Yakymiak, who is currently the expert of military programs in the Razumkov Center and Center for Defense Strategies in Ukraine. Captain Yakymiak has served in the Ukrainian Armed Forces for over 30 years, and his last position in active service before retirement was the Chief of Naval Forces Department in the National Defense University of Ukraine. Captain Yakymiak has a PhD in military science from the National Defense University of Ukraine, and he is the author of more than 200 scientific works in research areas such as national and international maritime security strategy, naval strategy, hybrid war at sea, and joint maritime operations. With these words, it is my pleasure to give the floor to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today, I have a very pleasant opportunity to participate in our seminar. My speech is devoted to study of Russian strategy and operational art on war in the Black Sea, lessons from experience of the war, the development of the theory of Russian naval art, and the prospects of future warfare at sea. Please, slide number 2. Dear colleagues, allow me to introduce myself. I took part in war in Black Sea from February 24 to June 2022 as an advisor for Ukrainian Task Force Commander in Odessa. Before that, I was also a participant of anti-terroristic operation, and some years ago I served as the mine warfare planning officer in the Ukrainian Navy headquarters in Sevastopol. Now, as a retired officer, I continue to conduct research for defense of Ukraine and work as an expert of two analytical centers. Starting my report, first of all, I want to tell you that the Ukrainians continue to defeat the Russian enemy in the Black Sea. And now Russian forces is pressed to Novorossiysk. Already in December and January this year, Ukraine continued to surprise the world with the innovative robotic maritime operations. And I'm grateful to my colleague, Tobias Kolakowski, who made speech before me for an interesting presentation about latest naval technologies in this war. Please, next slide. In my speech, we will consider the issues presented on the slide and look for answers to such questions. How did the main strategic goal and tasks of Russian forces in Black Sea change from 2022 to 2025? What indicators are appropriate to evaluate the results achieved by forces in the war at sea and their capabilities? And what is the biggest problem for the Russian forces in actions at sea? Some words about research methodology. First of all, the method of content analysis of military operation was applied, and the main events that led to significant changes in the situation at sea and caused the onset of new stages of military actions were determined. On the basis of comparative analysis of the Russian forces' goals and tasks at various stages of war, changes in the content of enemy strategy and operation at sea were determined too. Quantitative analysis was used to determine the amount of losses suffered by Russian forces and their remaining capabilities. Please, next slide. First of all, let's consider the development of the theory of Russian naval strategy. As you know, the first version of strategy of 1999 was published in the book Russian Naval Strategy, on the slide. The structure of the strategy and problems, its justification were defined in the publication Fundamentals of Naval Science. In the naval strategy of 2017, which is set out in the form of an official document, Fundamentals of Russian Federation State Policy in the Field of Naval Activity, one of the main tasks is defined as the destruction of the military and economic potential of the enemy by destroying his vital facilities from the sea. Let's ask a little bit ahead of time. Did the fleet fulfill this task in war against Ukraine? As for me, no, not done. Second point, can the force effectively fight against a high-tech enemy, both in the near field and in the ocean zone? The experience of war in the Black Sea proves that the Russian fleet did not fulfill this either. This strategy also planned that after 2025, robotic complexes, including unmanned subsurface vehicles, would be created and deployed for use at sea. As we can see from the level of development of maritime robotic system in Russia, this task is not being fulfilled now. Please, next slide. Slide 5 shows the main stages in the war on the Black Sea. As you know from my presentation at the seminar in 2023, the first stage of this war was characterized by the dominance of Russian forces at sea. However, from April 2, 2022, after the Neptune missile complex struck the Essen frigate and Moscow missile cruiser, the situation changed significantly, and the enemy withdrew his forces to the Crimean coast. The next time the situation changed on July. Then agreements on the Black Sea Grain Initiative were signed. This stage was characterized by the limited use of forces at sea. However, already on October 29, 2022, a drastic change in the situation took place. A combined attack by unmanned surface and aerial vehicles was carried out in Sevastopol, and 3 Russian ships were damaged. It was the world's first complex employment of such means at sea. During this stage, systematic attacks of robotic systems were carried out on Russian ships at sea. The Crimean bridge was also struck. However, on August 5, 2023, after attacks on amphibious ship Olnigorsky Khornyak near Novorossiysk, the tanker Sig in the Kerch Strait, and remote mooring device in the sea near the coast of Yuzhnaya Ozereyevka testified that Ukrainians had seized the initiative in the strategic struggle at sea. And on July 15, 2024, after attacks on naval bases in Crimea, amphibious ship Novocherkassk in Feodosia, missile boat Ivanovets near naval base in Novoozerny, amphibious ship Kunikov near South Crimea coast, Russian surface and underwater forces left Crimea Peninsula. From that time, the stage of blocking Russian forces in overseas began. During this stage, attacks by missile weapons, unmanned aerial and maritime vehicles were regularly carried out against Russian forces in Crimea, as well as in the Krasnodar region of Russia. Please, next slide. A new stage, 7th stage, began on December 6, 2024. The defense forces of Ukraine launched successful attacks against Russian forces at sea, in the air, above it, and on the sea coast with new type of unmanned surface system and innovation in the tactics. As you can see on the slide, in December 2024 and January 2025, the defense forces of Ukraine successfully employed uncrewed surface vehicles with new devices on their boards, FPV unmanned aerial vehicles, machine guns, and MLRS rockets. All these events testified to the transition to the stage of warfare at sea. Then, maritime robotic systems perform the tasks for destroying enemy forces in the occupied territory on land and in coastal areas. This trend indicates the possibility of complete destruction of Russian facilities and forces in Crimea and, if necessary, near Novorossiysk. Such actions create conditions for the liberation of Crimea and other coastal regions from the Russian Federation. Please, slide 7. The analysis of content of actions at sea in 2022-2025 made it possible to draw conclusions about changes in the Russian naval art. In essence, the Russian forces switched from the strategy of active action from the sea to create favorable conditions on land to a completely different strategy, namely the strategy of preserving fleet forces and withdrawing them from attacks. But the goal of disrupting Ukraine's economic activity at sea remained unchanged. Accordingly, the main tasks have also changed to from demonstration actions of the amphibious assaults and the blocking of Ukrainian surface forces at the bases to such basic tasks as conducting the defense of own naval bases and participating in the defense of important objects on the coast. The task of striking with sea-based cruise missile remained unchanged, but these strikes are now carried out from areas near Novorossiysk. The main directions of Russian naval research, as for me, should be as follows. First of all, determination of methods, ways for dispersing forces from the strikes from air, from sea, and second, creation and use of maritime robotic system units. Please, slide 8. To evaluate the effectiveness of tasks at sea, it is necessary to have certain indicators. In order to assess the level of dominance and ownership of the initiative in actions at sea, it is proposed to use an indicator for the percentage of the part of combat area where forces can be safely deployed. The results of assessment showed that during the first stage of the war at sea, the Russians controlled and have the opportunity to deploy its forces in 90% of the area of the combat zone, which was located only in the northwestern part of the Black Sea. However, as a result of Neptune missile strikes on Russian ships, this area decreased to 10%, to a coastal strip up to 15 kilometers wide along the coast of Crimea. Later, then, the area of hostilities at sea increased as a result of strikes by Ukrainian defense forces in the eastern part of the Black Sea. Russians control about 60% of this area. However, after actions that led to the withdrawal of Russian ships from Crimea to Novorossiysk, this area decreased to about 25%. That is, the Russian Federation can safely deploy its forces in a strip up to 20-25 kilometers wide along the Caucasian coast. Next slide. In order to evaluate the effectiveness of task performing by forces at sea, it is necessary to assess their capabilities. For evaluation, Russian forces' capabilities to strike with long-range caliber type missiles from sea carriers can be used the indicator for total conditional volley of missiles. The results of the calculation proved that these capabilities decreased from 80 to 60 missiles. The striking anti-ship missiles capabilities, ship to ship, decreased from 52 to 32 missiles. The amphibious capabilities have significantly decreased by 42% after destruction. Damage and long-term repairs of 7 out of 12 amphibious ships. The supply capabilities have also significantly decreased. Currently, only one of the 4 major naval bases in the Black Sea is used for basing forces, only in Novorossiysk. The capability to command and control of the forces has decreased to at least 5 command points of the strategic and operational level were destroyed or abandoned. Such Russian forces' capabilities will not allow them to fulfill their tasks. In addition, anti-ship missiles capabilities of ships and coastal units cannot be used by Russians due to the lack of large warships in the defense forces of Ukraine. Please slide 10. Some words about problems of Russian forces at sea. An analysis of the experience of the war at sea testifies to the significant problems that the Russian forces have. First of all, inability to quickly adapt to symmetrical actions and technological changes in war at sea. There are also insufficient capabilities to deal with strike missile weapons, which are used by the defense forces of Ukraine to strike surface and ground targets from the sea. A significant problem is the use of marines in land operations. Very important is the problem of insufficient Russian capabilities to combat maritime robotic systems and the actual lack in the development of these systems. I have no good information about this development now. Please, slide 11. Based on the results of conducted research on the war at sea in 2022-2025, the following main lessons have been identified. First of all, there has been a disruption of Russian forces' domination at sea and their strategic offensive actions from the south of Ukraine. As a result of successful action of the defense forces of Ukraine, the combat potential of Russian strikes and amphibious forces was significantly reduced, and Ukrainians seized the strategic initiative in the war at sea. Strategic export of grain from Ukraine was ensured. And the most important thing, conditions have been created to block enemy forces in the Novorossiysk region and liberate Crimea for using forces from the sea. Please, next slide. The analysis of the situation of beginning of 2025 and various scenarios of actions made it possible to determine the prospects for future warfare at sea. First of all, Russians will not be able to conduct active operations at sea due to their limited capabilities. The main task of Russian forces will be to defend the area of the base of their forces near Novorossiysk against attacks from the sea and from the air. At the same time, Ukrainian task forces, thanks to robotic joint maritime operations, are able to expand the scale of operations at sea and contribute to the liberation of Crimea. In addition, the success of Ukrainian forces at sea can be one of the important advantages in the future peace negotiations. And please, last slide. My presentation is complete. Thank you for your attention. Unfortunately, due to language difficulties, I will not be able to answer your questions well during the panel discussion. I ask my colleague, speaker Tobias Kolakowski, to take responsibility for the answer during this discussion. If you have any questions for me, please send them to the email address which is located on this slide. I will definitely write a detailed answer to each of your questions. Thanks again.
Sir, thank you very much for the interesting and very eye-opening presentation. As Captain said, he will not be taking any questions as of now. So, if I may I propose that we go directly to the next program point, which is the panel. And Dr. Kolakowski, there is just one seat left, and
Like Fortress Sveaborg out there.
yes, we will be happy to grill you and roast you for a period of 30 minutes. And again, a big thank you for all panelists already, both panelists already at this stage. So we will go to first audience questions. If you have any questions, please raise your hand, and we will pass on the mic to you.
Yes, thank you for two excellent presentations. I have a question about your point about bravery and how it's important to stand up if you think things are going the wrong direction. You know, you mentioned the brave officers who, admittedly, very belatedly, after the experiences of the Civil War, the Boer War, the Russo-Turkic War, finally did realize that it was senseless to send units against, artillery that was going to decimate them. How does that apply to today? If I ask you, do you think that we, the Western military defense analytical community, have enough ability to discern what's actually changed and what hasn't changed? When I listen to the presentations here today and yesterday, I get a feeling that what our keynote speakers were saying at the beginning is still very dominant. It's a return to mass, to attrition. I haven't heard enough about the other camp, which I mentioned yesterday also, which says, there is a totally different way of doing this. What we're seeing now, the things that seem to have been successful in the Russian-Ukrainian war, like drones, are still very dumb drones, and there's a lot smarter ways of doing these things than what we've done right now. Do you think our defense organization, let me also add that if I look at Ukraine, I do not see decentralized companies, well, I do see decentralized companies like we saw yesterday, but I especially see civil society stepping into the breach. I see a lot of civilian a variety of different players, from like digital agencies to indeed, small companies that produce stuff. I see those stepping into the on the front line, not sort of relics of the old industrial systems. Now, systems are also incredibly cumbersome, right? A lot of our officers still like to think that the lessons to be learned from the Russian-Ukrainian war are the ones that we've heard about here, and I'm not dismissing those. But you yourself said that there's another way of looking at these things. And do you think we, as Western organizations, have enough agility, openness to other solutions? And we talked a lot about the kinetic front here, but even on the non-kinetic front, there are so many things that we could do, which would be much cheaper. I'm glad that you mentioned the cost factor here, because it's enormous. So there is an argument to be made that all these large capabilities, very sophisticated, very exquisite technology that we've invested in, that we now see blown up to smithereens by very stuff, that there is even a lot further steps that could go in that direction. And I genuinely wonder whether we're open enough to these other elements, which in Ukraine just came forward because the government was so weak that all these other elements could start contributing. We have still relatively strong defense departments that can do these types of things, but they're particularly conservative from my point of view, and I will guarantee that I have only one point of view. So I really wonder whether we are open enough. I work in the Netherlands, a small country, with a relatively good tradition of innovation, even in the military field. But there I do not see the nimble small companies stepping in. I see the large national champions given money to innovate, whereby innovation is not what we see in the private sector, but it's what we see in typically in the military sector. Where so the nations give money for innovation to their own national champions, and before you know it, you end up with exquisite 1.0 and not exquisite 2.0 technology. So is the bravery there today in our military establishments to look back at war, but to also think creatively about how we could do it even better than the Ukrainians have done. So that's sort of the question. Sorry.
Okay, give me a second to. I have to say that I'm not a real expert on defense procurement processes or anything. Just from what I've seen and what I've heard, particular focus on organizational culture. And I think, given that you're from the Netherlands and maybe other smaller countries, and especially here up in Scandinavia, at least that's my impression from Central Europe, maybe also other smaller countries, Singapore, Israel, they have certain advantages because the bureaucracies are smaller, maybe the hierarchies up here in Scandinavia are also a little bit flatter, that allows for more agile processes. There are certain processes trying to foster a creative approach. For example, in the German Navy, we have the OPEX program. Yeah? So the idea that stands for operational experimentation. The idea that you're not going through a year-long process of developing something, procuring something, commissioning something, and then you realize, oh, that's not really what we wanted or needed, and then you're just stuck with it for 20 years, but gives space to experience. Maybe I think the term lease has come up. Yeah, we're leasing a system, we're trying out if it works out, if it awards us with the capabilities we really need, and if it doesn't, hey, we just hand it back and say, we're trying something else. So there are discussions and projects to try to foster this innovative capability. Still, I believe that our organizational cultures that we have built up have become so large and so inflexible that it's just really, really difficult. And sometimes it cannot even be explained by abstract rationality. Yeah? It's particular interests of certain departments or people who are within certain departments, which from a national level doesn't make any sense, because we have all these agencies who are dealing with each other in this bureaucracy. They develop self-interests, and yeah, it's from my perspective, it's just a really difficult challenge, and this is also why I've included this aspect in my presentation, because I think we are to a certain degree part of the challenge that we need to overcome.
No, thanks, Tobias. And my questions are very much piggybacking on that, and I agree entirely with your theses. So from there, my questions are basically about implementation. So the first thing that strikes me is Ukraine has developed a naval revolution, but the Ukrainian Navy has been a backseat player in that. The Maguras are a product of HOR. The Sea Babies are a product of SBU. Naval Special Forces are playing a role. Mm-hmm. The actual traditional Navy command and its infrastructure has been a trailing indicator in what's being accomplished. So does that say something more broadly about Ukraine's ability to perpetuate this after the war, when presumably the Navy is going to reassert some control over maritime policy? And does this say something about the receptiveness of traditional navies to this particular type of disruptive technology that is very much different from the ethos? It doesn't involve people spending much time at sea. So I guess that's question number one. Question number two is, in NATO navies' resistance to these innovations, should we blame the Americans? I mean, you mentioned the blue water debate. That's really an American debate, because a lot of waters are actually enclosed waters. If we think about Europe, the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and the Baltic are all relatively enclosed waters. Perhaps we could even think of the high north as an enclosed water if we think of, the actual amount of sea that is usable by surface ships. If we think East Asia, the Taiwan Straits are enclosed waters. The distance between Okinawa and the Chinese mainland are enclosed waters. So in listening to these debates about the limitations of USVs and some of this technology for blue water engagements, are we basically following the Americans down a path that's irrelevant to us? And the third question is really, and Stefan said that you will answer questions for his presentation. When's the invasion of Crimea coming?
I think he'll answer that in English himself.
The first question was role of navies with regard to there was one term I've just remembered that I've forgotten when thinking about the second and third question. Which was the keyword?
The receptiveness or resistance of navies to this particular type of disruptive technology.
Oh yeah, okay.
That was the role of the Navy in all these innovations that we saw, which was
Mm-hmm.
they were not players.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, the Navy was...
Okay, yeah, okay, got it. Okay,
was
got it.
Navy frigates.
Okay. Maybe let's start with the second question. I think I'm very Prussian in a certain sense, but still being English educated, I would say it's not only an American school of thought, but also very much originally, especially a British blue water tradition. So let's just call it Anglo-Saxon blue water school. This leads over to the first question. If we read the classical theoreticians, like for example Riviera Mahan, and we really closely look at factors, for example, they describe, then we very quickly will discover that the navies they describe are only suitable for a certain spectrum of countries, either because they don't have the resources, or because, if we're thinking about the British tradition, maritime trade and everything that, for example, Professor Andrew Lambert would describe as sea power state culture and so on, that many of these factors do not fit other countries. There are other schools of thoughts, coastal defense theory. I've mentioned Genicol, or the development or adaptation of the Genicol in early Soviet thinking, Maladaya Shkola, brick mortar school, very different. And I think it would be a mistake for a country just to follow a blue water school, just because it looks great to try to go for, I don't know, a carrier-based navy, or in earlier days just build as many battleships as possible. If the situation you're in doesn't fit the conditions, then it can become extremely counterproductive, actually. Yeah, and if we take these ideas and we apply them to the case of Ukraine, if you look at the Ukrainian strategic documents, you will find that approximately until 2020, 2021, something around there, the Mosquito fleet, what they called it, was very much a principal objective for them to obtain. And I would say a lot of the capabilities that the SBU and the HUR is using fits into this category. And probably other writers like General Kabanenko, the former Deputy Defense Minister of Ukraine, has published extensively about that. A few other retired Navy captains of Ukraine have also published about that extensively. Yeah, as a suitable concept, can actually be realized with the resources at hand. Now, since 2020, we have a change in the strategic documents. The word Mosquito fleet, to my knowledge, doesn't even appear anymore. And we have ideas that I think until 2035, I believe. Ukraine wants to have blue water sea control capabilities. They have been ordering the Ada-class corvettes from the Turks. They are using the UK-Norway Maritime Capabilities Initiative to develop capabilities. Some other countries are also doing some stuff, let's just say it that way. And that's all directed towards what you correctly described as the blue water approach. Do I think this is a proficient strategy to achieve the goals they have at hand under the circumstances they are currently facing? Just speaking from my personal opinion, no, I don't think so. I think actually they are doing a severe mistake by investing so many resources in capabilities that are probably not useful with regard to what they want to achieve. And even more, if we look at it from the maybe operational level, one of the great advantages they have had in facing an opponent who has significant surface-to-surface capabilities is that the Russians didn't know what to shoot at. If you don't have any ships, if you don't have any targets, you can have the most potent missiles in the world. Yeah? And these tiny little unmanned surface vehicles can be deployed in an extremely flexible way. Perfect. Now, the moment the Turkish hand over those corvettes and they have a solid piece of metal there in the Black Sea, I wonder how long that ship is going to survive. Yeah. Yeah, I think you've made a very good point there. Yeah, last point, invasion of Crimea. I really don't want to comment on that. Write an email to Captain Yakymiak.
Thank you very much. Both very interesting lectures, because I'm an infantry man. Everything which can float belongs to the Navy, according to my understanding. So I have a question to you. You mentioned the blue water Navy, brown water Navy, and you also mentioned history lessons learned. During the Second World War, Soviets used to have river flotillas. And right now we are planning to establish a river flotilla in this Ukrainian-Russian war. Maybe after yesterday's calls, this war will be terminated, so it's very difficult to speculate what kind of activities this flotilla might take, but I would like to hear what you think. What would be the task, role, modus of operandi of such naval creature or formation? Thank you.
I mean, the principal task of the Russian Navy since Peter the Great has always been to support land operations. And not in the style of the Anglo-Saxon model, where you have an expeditionary force that deploys blue water capabilities to any place in the world, but more in the sense of as a force that operates at the wet flank of the army and provides tactical support, or in a few cases also sea lift capabilities. If we're thinking about the Russo-Turkish wars, for example. The flotilla operations are actually what the Russians have always been very good at. And even being here in Helsinki, if we look at what the flotilla did during the Russo-Swedish wars, they were very capable and presented a lot of challenges to the Swedes. Now, under 21st century conditions, and that is something that that impacts all of these operations. The situation is a little bit changed, I would say, even though I haven't completely made up my mind about it. So I'm just talking from my gut feeling now. In that reconnaissance capabilities are much better than they've ever been before. The great advantage of navies has always been their flexibility. And if you combine that with the ability of the attacker to determine the location and the point of time of the main effort, this has been a crucial advantage. The US Marine Corps calls it the operational maneuver from the sea, for example, the landing at Incheon during the Korean War, or if we think about World War II, the Germans built the Atlantic Wall, and they had to build it from the top of Norway all the way down to the south of France because they didn't know where the Allies were going to land. The Allies, having sea control, could determine the place and time where they wanted to land. And that is now, I would say, that is this invisibility to a certain degree is no longer there. You can, using modern technologies, you have a much clearer picture of what the opponent is doing. That has implications for army operations. When we think about all the things referred yesterday, how difficult it is to mass forces and then go into maneuver warfare because the enemy can immediately spot you as soon as you go beyond a certain size of formation. But it also has severe implications for the Navy and for naval forces. And under these changed conditions, I'm not sure whether a river flotilla can achieve the same effects and especially the same element of surprise than it could do during the wars of Peter the Great or even World War II, or maybe the early Cold War period. Yeah, I haven't given that any serious thought, but that is just like the immediate feeling that I get. Yeah. That being said, of course, it's always nice, and I think it was also included in the lessons identified handbooks that NATO has published. That brown water capabilities and small craft that support raids and marines and operating in the littoral environment, yeah, these advantages they can provide. And I know both Finland and Sweden are very strong in these kind of littoral operations. And at the moment also Germany is looking at our Scandinavian friends and allies to see what advantages these very small craft can provide. And I would imagine the Russians are doing the very same thing, especially now maybe as another factor that the dams have been blown up, and the whole Dnieper estuary is just a huge wetland where there is space for the employment of such brown water capabilities. That would be.
We also have an experience how to bring small ships through the rivers.
Mm-hmm.
System of channels on the
Yeah.
Russian side.
Yeah, true.
Okay, thanks.
Do you have any other questions or comments?
Yeah, thank you, Tobias. You've talked about kind of cultural obstacles historically to development of, say, the aircraft carrier or the submarine. Can you detect in your line of work a cultural sense within established navies that they don't like the drone idea? That it's kind of, it's not very naval, it's kind of a... I just wonder if you've picked up any kind of anti-drone kind of sentiment within navies. That you...
I mean, we've just talked about the example of Ukraine, where it's at least curious that the naval leadership pursues traditional, conventional fleet dreams, while at the same time witnessing how well their asymmetric campaign has worked. But on a more general level, I think the entire naval history is full of these examples. In its originating country, the Jeanne d'Arc could not persevere. I think under Admiral Aube, it maybe lasted 4 or 5 years Then the naval leadership that was inspired by Janekol was thrown out, and traditional blue water old school commanders took place again. In the Soviet Union, it lasted as long as the resources were extremely limited and the technological base wasn't there. As soon as Stalin was in power and he had the capabilities, the first thing he wanted was battleships, big battleships and everything that could represent the status of the Soviet Union. The World War II was over. The first thing he wanted afterwards was, well, now I need Stalingrad battle cruisers, during an era where everyone was like, okay, that doesn't really make any sense. Yeah, there always seems to be this push towards the blue water school, just because the lure of these great ships is just so fascinating, and maybe also because, of course, you're more versatile. I mean, the things we're talking about are really only usable under these very conditions. If we're thinking about the whole range that a Navy has to cover, especially during peacetime, naval diplomacy and coalition building with alliance partners overseas, and power projection, or at least contribution to a power projection for smaller navies that are within an alliance network. Also patrolling the high seas, constabulary tasks. Some navies do nuclear deterrence. Also the whole spectrum that navies carry out. For most of these tasks, such asymmetric and to a certain degree Janekol capabilities don't really help. So why only focus on an extremely narrow capability set when you're not forced to do it? And I think that is one of the reasons why most Navy, also most chiefs of the Navy or people in charge of the procurement programs, or politicians, if they are included in the process, want to go for more traditional capabilities.
Thanks again, Tobias. Lieutenant Commander Steve Wall, Assistant Defence Attaché from Australia. I just wanted to pick up on that as well. I think at the moment it's very easy to get fascinated by what's happening in a certain set of circumstances which really lead itself to those. But I think it's really important about balance. And that was just picking up on that last comment, that there's that balance between the blue water, the requirements of especially a Navy like Australia, where we've got a lot of water, a lot of blue water, but we also have confined waters. Our operating areas to the north of us are confined waters. So I think it's really important to emphasise the idea of balance with that, and in fact integrating these new technologies into some of the traditional things. There's no reason you can't have a platform that provides its own, IAMD to give itself protection and around, but also then use that to deploy smaller vessels from it as the type of a mothership, or have working in conjunction with those. So I guess that last comment there was was where I was going, is to try and emphasise the fact that there needs to be balance from those, because the effects that you want from the certain capabilities and the asymmetric capabilities that we're talking about worked extremely well in these circumstances, but it's not necessarily going to work all the time in all circumstances. So I think it's really important to grab that idea of balance, but also not lose the ability to be responsive and be proactive, and that cultural leadership challenge is quite real.
Mm-hmm. And they are also country-specific. Situation of Australia is completely different than the situation of Ukraine. Yeah, that's.
Or to the effects that you're after.
Maybe also to give a little bit of credit to this way of thinking, because we've just been very critical of some of the elements of the Ukrainian naval strategy. Of course, you're also very limited with these asymmetric means. Naturally, and also from what I've read and heard, and we've also just read it on the slides, the Ukrainians would like to do more. So it's great to have a degree of anti-access. It's great to have some sea denial capability, but ideally, of course, you would like to do more. So to use naval terminology, you ideally want to establish sea control yourself. You might want to maintain sea control, and ideally, you want to exploit sea control. And for example, if we are thinking about the latest aspect, exploiting sea control, from what I've heard, the idea of establishing a blockade of the Russian coast is extremely lucrative to some Ukrainian thinkers, and preventing all these merchant ships from transporting Russian oil and grain and all the things that the Russians are exporting, that's basically keeping their economy alive. Now, if you want to do that, or at least if you want to do that in accordance with international law, which is super important, I think, for the Ukrainians, just to always be on the wide good side, and on the other side is the aggressor who's breaking international law, especially if you're dependent on the global West for support and arms and so on. That's an important aspect to consider. If you want to act in accordance with international law, you basically need a traditional fleet that is capable of installing a blockade, that is capable of deploying prize commandos, carry out the blockade, check for contraband, and all the stuff that's involved with such activities. Maybe at some point in the future, uncrewed systems can also magically force merchant ships to stop, and then maybe some robots come out and take control of the merchant ship. I don't know. But at the stage in history we are in right now, I think that's only a capability that a traditional fleet can carry out.
Thank you for a great presentation, Christina Mellin from the Swedish Defence Research Agency. I have a question that ties into this first kind of dilemma or discussion that you mentioned, whether this is a revolution in naval warfare or if it's specific to the Black Sea context. When you look at the kind of adaptation of Russian capabilities and Russian operational art in the Black Sea, do you see comparable Russian conclusions about different operational areas? Like in the Black Sea, in the Baltic Sea, in the Northern Fleet? Is there a discussion in Russia that they see the conclusions that they have about the Black Sea being valid for the Baltic and the Northern Fleet as well? At least, I mean, what you said that the kind of tasks for the Navy in the Northern Fleet is perhaps quite different from what they do in the Black.
Yeah, also to be honest, I don't have a good primary source in my head that would provide an explicit answer to what you've just asked. But just talking or thinking about the scenarios, I would say the tasks are very different. In the Black Sea, at least up to now, that's really the only sea zone where Russia may thought to have had a chance to establish sea control themselves, because the Bulgarians and the Romanians and the Georgians and the Ukrainians don't really had or didn't have the assets to dispute or to establish sea control themselves. So that leaves the Turkish, and the Turkish Navy is very strong, but yeah, they may have thought about having a chance. At least I know from the past, from the Soviet time, that establishing sea control against the Turkish Navy was one of the tasks they even trained for. Now in the Baltic Sea, the situation looks very different. with all other literal countries of the Baltic Sea being NATO member states. And yeah, I think here it's much more appropriate to think of the Russian Navy in the way we are now looking at the Ukrainian Navy in the Black Sea, and what they could potentially do to limit access of NATO vessels into the Black Sea, limit the freedom of movement of NATO vessels in the Black Sea, deny access as much as possible. And up in the north, well, you have the nuclear deterrent and the second strike capability and so on, the bastion concept and everything that relates to that. So I think there the concept of operations will also look very different. Nevertheless, on the technical level, and this is what Patrushev and they've all said, I think they can learn quite a bit from the Black Sea context and the experiences they've made. And there are also certain similarities that we may think about. For example, if we are thinking about Crimea and we are thinking about the canals, Donoslav Bay. Donoslav Bay was I think the southern naval base of Ukraine. Was at least one of the major naval bases of Ukraine that was blocked by the Russians. We've now seen the Strait of Kerch and everything that has to do with blocking small waterways, crucial waterways. And if you look, for example, at the Baltic states, there are also certain geographic features that could be important, that's worth to take a look at. And I'm fairly sure the Russians are taking a look at it. And if we are looking at the Ukrainian side and how they have targeted Russian infrastructure at the Black Sea, we should be concerned and take a very serious look at our infrastructure, NATO infrastructure at the Baltic Sea. Are we capable of securing the infrastructure we need to conduct such a campaign? So yeah, I think it makes sense to switch the roles of Russia and Ukraine in the Black Sea when we look at the situation in the Baltic Sea, for example. Made it?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Kolakowski. May I suggest a round of applause? And so once again, thank you very much to both keynote speakers and to the audience for very, very good questions and an interesting insight. And hereby close this session. Thank you.